Welcome everybody to session 12 of the online advocacy and campaign training, which is going to be focusing on budget analysis and tracking. Exciting stuff. We have with us our absolute champion in the area of investment for children, Bob Muchabaiwa, who is based in Nairobi and is the manager for investment in children as part of the Child Rights Governance Global Initiative. The work that Save the Children does in investments in children, I'm going to ask Bob to tell us about, but I'm just going to take this opportunity to welcome him to our webinar and to go over a little bit of his background, which I can promise you is pretty impressive. Bob has over 12 years of practical experience in child rights, budgeting, and economic governance, more generally at national, regional, and international level. And he's worked all over the world. The list of countries I have here continues: Bangladesh, Cambodia, Myanmar, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Swaziland, Zambia, Balkans, Kosovo. He's currently working on a book on social accountability in the child rights sector and has authored and contributed to several handbooks and guides on budgeting for children. He's recently authored a handbook on child responsive budgeting for the government of South Sudan. He's also produced a civil society guide on child-friendly budgeting in Zimbabwe. Between 2001 and 2008, Bob managed the Child-Friendly National Budget Initiative. This was a joint project of Save the Children, UNICEF, and NANGO in Zimbabwe before he moved to Botswana, where he was working for a regional organization, SADC CNGO. Bob moved to Save the Children in 2012 and has been working as part of the Child Rights Governance Global Initiative. His current profile includes work on fiscal policy, budget, transparency, and accountability in public spending, aid and debt as it relates to child rights. Bob has 2 master's degrees in business administration and development studies, in addition to an honors degree in business. Wow, Bob, you bring us a lot of experience, and I hope that in the next 30 minutes of this webinar we can get you to share some of your experience. But I recommend to everybody, if you don't already have Bob in your email addresses, put him in now, because I'm pretty sure you're going to want to talk to him afterwards. So Bob, thank you for joining us today. How are you? How is Nairobi?
No, Nairobi is very good, and thank you so much for the introductions. I think that was too much. I'm a child rights activist interested in economic governance issues. I'm sure that will suffice. Nairobi is sunny and looking forward to this webinar.
Excellent. So Bob, I'm going to dive in here. Social accountability. What do you mean by that? That's an incredibly large concept, and I feel like it's getting bandied about a lot nowadays, especially in the discussion around the post-MDGs, good governance. What do we mean by social accountability? What do you understand that to be?
I must start by saying social accountability is what every organization interested in civic empowerment should be talking about. But to be simple, social accountability is about citizens, including children, ordinary men and women, engaging in participatory actions to hold government and service providers accountable, and in our case, for their commitments to children. So the defining characteristics of social accountability, if you compare it with traditional forms of accountability, like working with supreme audit institutions, parliaments, etc., are that, number one, is the citizens, is the children, is the ordinary persons taking initiative to hold the governments to account. Number two, it is the citizens themselves controlling the space or the interaction between duty bearers and claim holders. And number three, social accountability involves constructive dialogue. I think that is fundamental. There is continuous constructive engagement between claim holders and duty bearers in exacting accountability. So if I'm to summarize, We are saying instead of relying on representative democracy, on parliament,
you will now be placed into conference. To mute your
instead
line,
of
press
relying
star
on
6.
official
To
government
unmute,
processes,
press
citizens can be
#6.
proactive and engage in various actions to demand accountability from government and service providers.
Excellent. I mean, that's a pretty expansive concept, and something that I think a lot of our countries are very interested in terms of the work that Save the Children does.
Absolutely.
Tell me how budget tracking fits into this. How is budget tracking a form of social accountability? What do we mean by budget tracking?
Now, social accountability occurs in different sectors. And for purposes of simplicity, I would classify social accountability actions into 3 broad areas. One, we have social accountability aimed at influencing budgeting and spending decisions. In other words, citizens who wants to hold governments, whether local or central, accountable for their decisions that concerns how public resources are mobilized and utilized. That is one area. Then the second area is citizens holding public officials and service providers accountable for the specific services delivered to the public, and we are interested in services delivered to children. And then, of course, we have accountability for the general child rights situation or state of play. Now, budget tracking is part of the first component, whereby citizens, including children, are interested in having their voices heard on how governments are mobilizing, sharing, and allocating public resources. Why is it so important? First, services delivered to children have to be paid for. And everything happens via government budgets. So whether you want to deliver education, health, or whatever you name it, that happens via the budget. And it is the instrument through which we actually measure the commitment, the real commitment of governments to children and to other citizens and stakeholders. So the connection between social accountability and budget tracking is that budget tracking is a tool or is a method that is used to exact accountability.
That is a really good way of putting it. And I like when you said it's about measuring commitment, because that's an incredibly difficult thing to do with governments. I just want to take this opportunity to address our listeners. If anybody's got questions for Bob, or if you've got any examples that you'd like to share with us, please feel free to do so. If you don't have a microphone, you can type in your question or your example or your comment into the IM section of this conversation. All right, so back to you, Bob. So tell me, some people are telling me there's a difference between budget tracking and expenditure tracking. And is this related to your 2 points here about the social accountability, both influencing and holding accountable? Talk us through what you mean by expenditure, and then the difference between those two.
Yes, let me say, in general, the two terms are sometimes used interchangeably, but they are different. When one is doing budget tracking, you are essentially using the budget book or the estimates as the main instrument of analysis. You are looking at the allocation, the composition of budgets, what was spent, what was not spent, what was provided for, and what was actually utilized. But when you go to expenditure, it's a higher level process, which looks at the process of spending. So you are not, just to give a very simple example here, if you are analyzing a budget for Ministry of Education, if you're doing budget tracking, you are, for example, asking yourself, how much was allocated to administration, to staff, to specific programs? And then you go on to ask how much was actually spent at the end of the day. So you are looking at variances between what was allocated and what was actually spent. So you can come up with conclusions like out of the 100 million that was provided for the Ministry of Health, 20% went to admin and 80% was spent out at the end of the year. But expenditure tracking goes deeper by saying how was the 100 million actually spent. So you're looking at issues of procurement. How did, if a request is met, how much time did it take to get the money? Did it finally reach the intended beneficiaries? Were the procedures, the spending procurement procedures followed? Yeah. So expenditure tracking analyzes how a particular allocation gets spent, looking at the procurement process, the tendering process, and the actual use of that money. But the budget, you are more interested in the figures, the estimates.
Okay, so before I continue, this sounds pretty complicated, Bob. Is this something we have staff that have capacity to do, or is this something that we often work with partners and universities to do? Because I can already imagine people, they're saying to themselves, I can barely manage my own budget. How am I going to analyze a national budget? How do we do this in reality in our country offices? How does it actually play out?
I must start by saying over the past 3 years, what we have seen is the strengthening of our internal capacities. By our, I'm referring to Save the Children, country and regional programs. I'm aware that a number of countries have actually been hiring experts to be focusing on this work as well, which for me is a good step. So within Save the Children, capacity is definitely improving, and we can also pick a similar trend within our partnership, which for me is an opportunity for us to launch this work even further post 2015. We are able to actually do more of this kind of work systematically and effectively, which for me is an opportunity. But let me say what is important at this stage is for people to locate this work within their existing programs. If you're doing child protection, how do you do budget tracking within that? If you're doing health work, education work, so we don't see work on budget analysis and tracking as separate or removed from our ongoing pieces of work.
But it's something that can complement our other thematic areas, so really kind of using it to strengthen everything. It's an approach, really. It's not just one activity. So Solomon is asking, are there specific tools for these types of analysis, and when do you use the information?
It's a very good questions. There are specific tools, I must say. We may not be able to exhaust all of them, but what guides which tool to use is the objective of the process. And let me just quickly run through some of the key points to consider in terms of, before I outline specific tools. When we are doing budget tracking or budget analysis and expenditure tracking, in general, the idea is to look at if the overarching objectives, the child-friendliness of budgets, but also to what extent are individual governments moving towards progressive realization of children's rights. And at a practical level, what are they measuring? They are measuring adequacy of budgets. They are measuring composition of budgets. Yeah, where is money going to? They are measuring allocative efficiency. They are measuring equity, sustainability, and impact of budgets. Now, depending on the objective that you choose, there are many tools, and a couple of them. One, budget analysis, public expenditure tracking surveys, participatory budgeting, independent budget analysis. So there are a couple of tools that are available that we could use to do this kind of work. So my proposal is this. If, for instance, you are interested in budget and expenditure tracking, the best tool to use is public expenditure tracking, for example, through public expenditure tracking service. You are developing a questionnaire and specific matrices to complete. If you are interested in looking at issues of adequacy, independent budget analysis becomes the most appropriate, and budget instance analysis. Those are some of the tools that you could use.
Okay, and people can find these suggestions and these tools in session 12 of the online training. Bob was the main author of this chapter, so just so that people know, you can always go back to the session, reflect on that information, and again, reach out to Bob if you have thoughts and have questions around this. So that's good to hear, and it's important. I think I really like that you said, it's really the objective of your activity that will dictate what tool you have, because I think a lot of countries have developed tools. What are some of the best examples of work that you've seen happening in budget analysis, and why were they good?
Globally, there are many examples of budget analysis work. I will cite a few from within the Save the Children family. Bangladesh, Pakistan, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Uganda, they've done excellent work on budget analysis. And what are the outstanding things we find in those studies? Number one, it starts with a very good TOR, which is able to spell out exactly what you want to find out. So you're not just doing
TOR for everybody is terms of reference. I'm against any acronyms in my webinar.
Oh,
sorry,
sorry, Shani.
No problem, carry on.
If you define exactly what you want to analyze, and like I've said, if your objective is to assess equity of spending, it's clearly laid out, then the analysis is likely to give us the correct answers. If you're measuring adequacy, if you want to look at the budget assumptions, so let's get the terms of reference right. Number two is the correct balance between the revenue and expenditure sides. In most cases, people are interested in allocations alone without looking at the available resource base. So it's always useful to get a sense of the revenue context. What is the fiscal space available? How much resources could be available? So when we then compare what is allocated and what is spent, we contextualize that. Then number three is to be able to use the most appropriate tools. And that is dependent on number 1 and 2. For example, what do I mean? Just recently, we've been doing work with Rwanda on a budget analysis study in Rwanda, and we agreed to do a bit of equity analysis. So all we needed is to ensure we have the correct instruments to measure equity of spending. Geographically, in terms of gender, in terms of programs. And then I must also say you would need to link that analysis with child rights outcomes or situations. And let me elaborate on this point. We're not an economic think tank that should just be doing budget analysis for the sake of it. But we do budget analysis because we want to reduce child mortality. We do budget analysis because we want children to be in school. So we should be able to say spending on education has been declining, and that has led to maybe worsening of child rights outcomes. So if budget analysis and tracking is not linked to specific child rights, then there is a problem. And then the next point is we should be solution or action oriented. A budget analysis study should ultimately be able to provide policy pointers, what then needs changing in terms of budgeting process. And this is where the difference is. And many times when I comment on budget analysis study, it's not enough to say 20% of the GDP spent on education. So what? What needs to be done? And then the last point is, if we ask the why question, I have seen a number of studies that says 90% of the education budget is going to salaries. Why is it like that? Or so much percentage is going to child protection and not to health? We have to investigate the why questions. And the why questions will help us come up with proper policy proposals. And for us to do that effectively, and this is the good practice we are obtaining from the countries I've mentioned, we have to interview the government officials, the relevant ministries. So we are not just doing a civil society analysis based on what we read in the newspapers or what we have heard in the workshops, but we're talking to the responsible authorities. And the recent case study of Rwanda is very classic. We probed Minister of Education, why is spending like this? We probed Minister of Health, what are the bottlenecks? And then we're able to come up with policy propositions that even the government could not contest.
Excellent. I mean, that sounds really relevant, so that we're looking at both kind of what our perceptions are, but we're talking to the government officials with this. We also do capacity building of government officials in some of this work. Is that true? My understanding is, part of one of the challenges that was identified was that actually government officials themselves had a real challenge actually budgeting, allocating their budgets. Can you talk a little bit about the partnerships or the work that we've done with civil society and government to actually use those recommendations to improve their budgeting?
There are many of our countries' offices that have actually been working with governments very directly. And this brings me back to the earlier discussion we're having. What underpins success in investment in children or budgeting work? And I mentioned earlier on the issue of defining the terms of reference clearly, and one would frame it differently and say defining the research problem. And I want to link that to what I'm going to say now. I believe effective capacity building of governments is dependent on our analysis of what are government's limitations. Where is the problem? Because we're not just going to run a budgeting workshop for governments, but we run workshops on the basis of what we feel are the problems. And I'll give an example. We have been doing some work with South Sudan, for example, and the bottom line has been an under-prioritization of social sectors, and then also weak public finance systems that are not sensitive to child rights. So the intervention that we then propose is to say, how do you prioritize or how do you elevate children on the political agenda? And then how do you ensure that the system of government, the public finance system, budgets with the best interests of children? So we have seen lots of good work going on in South Sudan. We have seen lots of good work going on in Bangladesh, for example, with discussions with Ministry of Finance to try and have a very comprehensive framework for child rights-based budgeting. We have also seen similar work with the local government in Uganda, where we say, how do you ensure children are at the center of planning and budgeting? More so if they are, as is the case in African countries. Uganda is more than 50% of the population being children below 18 years. So capacity building is happening, targeting different arms of government. We have examples of capacity building targeting local authorities. We have examples of capacity building targeting parliaments to help them analyze budgets from a child rights perspective and defend specific allocations to child-focused sectors. We also have specific examples of capacity building targeting Ministry of Finance. I recall part of my work, what I did in Zimbabwe with Ministry of Finance, is raising awareness on child rights-based budgeting. How do you do a child rights impact assessment? Why is it important? And how do you do it? How do you ensure that your budget template, your budget book is designed in such a way that you can track spending on children? So the capacity building is a fundamental element of our work, because as you may know, you cannot transform spending patterns without engaging public finance institutions. That is not possible by working with civil society only. No.
So that is really good for us to keep in mind. I mean, not only is it a way of identifying obstacles and barriers and bottlenecks in kind of how resources are getting to countries, but it's also about looking at commitments, and it's about kind of identifying who we can engage with to take this forward, including children. So some of the things that you do, I know, is working with children to do budget tracking. Now, my understanding is that happens at a very local level. Do you have a good example of where we've done that?
Absolutely. And I will be biased by starting with Zimbabwe. Because I worked there for quite a long time. But I'm very much aware that there's lots of good work going on in a number of countries. Let me give an example of Zimbabwe and then maybe Rwanda. What has been happening is that the processes started with capacity building of children, raising the awareness on the linkages between budgeting and children's rights, giving them the basic economic literacy they require to read and interpret budget, and then get them to mobilize each other. And then ultimately they consult themselves on what should be priorities for the next government budget, where should money go, and also even supporting them to do child-focused social accountability. The handbook that we are working on social accountability, we've actually called it child-focused social accountability, with the aim of putting children at the center, seeing children not as beneficiaries, but as active agents in the transformation process. So the case studies are quite many, but they are also dependent on the scope of the work. Cambodia, for example, they're doing lots of work at the local government level there. What I would underscore at this stage is, let us be clear of the purpose of engaging the different stakeholders, including children. Let us ensure the methods are child-friendly, and Save the Children has produced a very good guide, the principles on child participation, and they're very elaborate in terms of the how-to on engaging children. But I'm sure participants will be thrilled to know that given spaces and opportunity, children have been able to influence budgets in Zimbabwe, in Rwanda, in Nicaragua. We're seeing lots of promising case studies across the world. And I'm sure with more commitment, more resources, children can do more.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's really great. And last week we had a webinar session on child participation, and there was a lot of discussion about the role of children in influencing and really being able to change the mind of government officials and policymakers. So I think that's really great, and people should just take a look at the session to see the tools that are available there. So again, just reaching out to any of the listeners, if people have questions or if they have examples that they'd like to share with us, please do share that either with your microphone or in the IM section. So, Bob, one of the things that I do is I analyze the advocacy monitoring tool results that come out of countries. And one of the questions we ask them is, do you do budget tracking? And I'd say about a third of our countries, well, not a third of our countries, but a third of the advocacy initiatives, I think last year there were about 350, said that they do budget tracking. Now, to me, if you have policies in place in a government, if you have laws and policies that have made commitments to help, budget tracking would be the next logical
Absolutely.
But I have also seen where the costing of those policies have resulted in governments really kind of stepping back and saying, oh no, I don't think we can do this. And my example is when I worked in South Africa on the children's bill, we spent 10 years lobbying for that bill. And at the last hour, the government brought in economists to cost it, and they ended up cutting the bill in half because they just said it would be impossible to fund this. So how do we balance kind of those commitments and the resources that a government has without letting governments walk away from children's rights? So, really, there was a big fight after that costing, because we said, you can't limit it because of that. You still have to have ambitions for children to achieve children's rights. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I found costing to be a very tough issue.
Interesting example of the South African. Of course, when you start costing a bill, sometimes it's also problematic. But costing a plan is a lower level process, because then you are taking a bite. You're not taking the whole loaf at once, but you take bites. Now, let's start from the principle before we go to the practice. The principle in the UNCRC is progressive realization of children's rights.
Exactly, yeah.
Article 4. Now, the principle stresses the need for governments to make steps forward and not backwards. We are aware that you may not achieve all rights in the same year or at once, but the idea is progressive realization. And I think that is the message we should be sending to government, that step by step we should be able to make progress. That is a matter of principle. But now, looking at practice, good budgeting is informed by costing. In fact, when we do budget analysis, we always say, look at the policy. If there is a policy, is there a strategy or plan? If there is a plan, is the plan costed? If the plan is costed, is it reflected in the budget? And then we move on the cycle. Without costing, it is then difficult even for us to measure adequacy. For example, we encourage people working in different thematic sectors. If you're working in the area of the health sector, for example, look at the health sector plan. Get the stakeholders to cost the health sector plan. So when the Minister of Health is allocated a certain amount, we are able to do variance analysis between what is costed and what is provided for, and then maybe suggest a process of progressively moving towards the ideal situation. But without a cost, it is difficult. So for me, I would say, let's cost the different and lower level plans. We should cost an education sector plan. We should cost a health sector plan. We should know how much it takes to deliver social protection or social assistance, because that costing in itself becomes a tool for mobilizing resources. It can actually inspire governments even to do more, to know that, okay, this is what we need. Yes, we know in some cases people get scared and then they decide to hide behind the huge figures, but actually good budgeting engenders costing. And we encourage our different sectoral teams to ensure the sector plans are costed, and that becomes a tool for advocacy. In fact, when I go to Minister of Finance, if I'm working with a particular country like Kenya, for example, they are running this social assistance program for orphans and other vulnerable children. And I say we must know what would it take to deliver that program to all needy children. Then we go to Minister of Finance and say, you did well, you allocated 450 million Kenyan shillings, but we actually needed 10,000. So next year we may increase to 500. The next year we increase to 600 until we get to 900,000, in line with the principle of progressive realization of rights.
So, I mean, that's a really good point. It's about this kind of constantly improving and constantly striving towards the realization. Because I think one of the other things we've seen in some countries is the government, the ministry is given a big chunk of money and they don't actually have the capacity to absorb that. And so there's lots of underspending. I mean, you have a lot of countries where the education bill is underspent. Because the schools aren't built, so they can't employ the teachers. So, I think that's a really great point to reiterate there. One of the questions that you said...
Can I make a point, Shani, because you have raised a very important point. Why expenditure tracking is also important. Because then you are able to answer those questions that you're raising. Why are certain resources disbursed in September, 3 months before the end of the year, when they should have been disbursed in March? Why is there overspending or underspending? Yeah. So public expenditure tracking actually helps you uncover those things. In some cases, it's an issue of capacity. In some cases, it's an issue of poor cash flow management. In some cases, it's an issue of unclear systems and procedures. So if people go beyond just looking at the budget book and look at this expenditure process, we will be able to answer those questions. And this is where the difference is made for children.
And I think that is increasingly important when we look at countries that are looking at decentralization of services.
Yes.
Like Kenya, like
Yes.
many of the countries
Yes.
in
Yes.
your region.
Yes.
So I think that's really good to keep in mind. And I really like your advice about don't look at the full law, look at the strategy. Because that's also something that I think is a very helpful tip in this.
Yeah.
So, Bob, moving along swiftly, because I know I've got millions of questions, but I also want to make sure that I'm getting the whole spectrum.
Sure.
How do we do budget tracking in emergency situations, in humanitarian situations, in kind of hostile environments where a government is not interested in sharing their budget with us? What do we do there? Ethiopia sometimes is not very open to us digging through their budgets. What do we do in that situation?
Yeah, that's a very 2 points. Number one, budget analysis and tracking is enabled by access to budget information as a principal position. And we always advise our country offices and regional offices that if you want to engage in budget work, the pressure point that you should start with is access and availability of user-friendly information. If you don't have access to a budget book, the expenditure reports are not available, the audit reports are not available, you have not access to financial policies, it's very difficult. So we have to start by demanding that governments should be open with financial information. And like many countries, we have an office in Myanmar that is trying to do budget work, but they're constrained. They can't even get budget estimates. So this is point number one. Point number two now speaks to the approach. I believe we should still do budget even in emergency or conflict situations. Just yesterday, we had a meeting with the PDQ for South Sudan, and we were saying the humanitarian crisis obviously derails a number of processes, but that should not be an excuse for not engaging in this work for a variety of reasons. One, children suffer more in terms of crises, humanitarian crisis. Two, there is actually bound to be abuse of systems and procedures. And three, people are likely to be caught up in a survival mode and forget to connect humanitarian work with the development work, which is at the heart of Save the Children's theory of change. We work in the continuum, in the entire continuum of humanitarian to development. We do both. We're not just looking at one area. So as we deliver humanitarian services, we need to start conversations on how do we organize a recovery program, how do we organize financing for education, financing for strengthening of public finance institutions, etc. Unfortunately, and I must admit, we are building the evidence base on how to do work in humanitarian context, investment in children work in humanitarian context. So South Sudan, the Philippines, and many other countries are helping us in that regard. And lastly, I want to emphasize the idea of approach in this. And I'll use Ethiopia as a good example. Our country office has been able to navigate the political, economic context because of the approach. Where you find yourself working in a fairly closed environment, the best way is to try and collaborate with the government. where you can, but still maintaining your autonomy and still maintaining your independence. There is a big program in Kenya called the Protection of Basic Services, which is a social accountability initiative led by government. But we have said, instead of removing yourselves and say, oh no, this is a state process, we locate ourselves within that framework and influence from within. And gradually government opens up spaces for yourselves. So it's the approach, it's the confidence building that should go into this exercise, because we will never do budget work without getting information and winning the confidence of governments.
Wow, I mean, that's a really key issue, how we approach this, how we balance kind of our engagement with government so that we can take this forward, but at the same time maintain our independence and maintain a strong voice of the communities that we work with and the children that we're engaging in this.
Yes.
Cool. It's no easy task, Bob, and I'm so happy that you are here to help us with this. I encourage countries to really think about the budget work that they are doing and any opportunities that they see in their advocacy work, to think about where is the resourcing behind these policies that we've been advocating for? Where is the income and how are they spending it as the next step for the process of our engagement, and to really think about including that in programs and projects across all the thematic areas. I think that's a very key point that Bob brought up. Bob, we're coming to the end of our webinar, and this has been really interesting, and I know we could talk for ages. What are some of the top tips that you would give to somebody sitting in a country office who says, I really think this is an interesting area? How can we take that forward? And actually, just before you do that, Rifat has just asked a question. Do you think budget tracking is not only for policy influence, but escalating empowerment? For example, budget tracking at macro level, where school budgets can facilitate community empowerment processes so they can lead advocacy for school improvement.
Yes. No, he is right. There are many other side benefits of engaging in budget tracking work. Empowerment is one, and the other one is strengthening the social contract between citizens and government. Take, for instance, I am a taxpayer, so when I pay a tax, I have a moral right of engaging with the government, and government has a moral right of accounting to me on how it is utilizing its resources. It is also about sustainability, ownership of development processes. When I do budget tracking, I always give people an example of partners living together and their children. I say, if I know how much my partner earns and they know how much I am earning and the children are aware of the income available in the house, we actually save together. We become more responsible. When we are broke, everybody understands. So it's different when, so the benefits for sure, Rifat, you're right. It's not just policy change. It's a whole range of things. Now, let's go to the tips. Number one, we have to understand the centrality of this work to achieving the mission and vision of Save the Children. Our theory of change says results at scale. I cannot imagine Save the Children being able to reach out to every child in the world. The surest way of doing that is to get governments to work for children through public spending processes. So in as much as we're doing fantastic work in any thematic work, we need to scale it up via government ownership and commitment of resources. That, I think, for me is important. Whether it's child protection, whether it's health, whether it's education, sustainability of these actions will only be achieved via public spending and budgeting. So if country offices and regional offices see the significance of this, we are halfway into achieving the theory of change. Number two tip, we have a model on investment in children, which we say for you to achieve sustainable investment in children, you have to work on 4 elements. If one of the elements is not properly addressed, we may not achieve. And what are these elements? Number one, we're looking at the available resource bases, the fiscal space. Number two, we are looking at how those resources are allocated, those allocation. Number three, we look at how those resources are utilized. And number four, we look at the governance of those resources, which conveniently we call public finance management. And that talks about a whole range of issues like political will, policy framework, strong institutions, responsive government, transparency, accountability. Now, what it means is you cannot be effective if you want to transform spending patterns by just looking at one element alone. It's good you may focus on just looking at allocations, but if the allocations are abused, then there's a problem. So we also have to work with others in then tracking the utilization, but checking the governance framework, you know, the reach, the targeting, the transparency, the accountability. Let me give you an example. The World Bank did a very good study in 2010, which revealed that spending achieves more for children if it is transparent and is done in an accountable framework. And so we can't ignore the public finance management elements. So the second tip is that we need to balance our programs, ensure we interrogate the available resources, the allocation, the utilization, and the public finance management system. Then the third tip is consistency in engagement. Transforming spending patterns cannot happen in a year or two. Systematic engagement is required with ministries of finance, with line ministries, with donors, with different actors. That is fundamental. The fourth point I need to emphasize is we should work more robustly with the sectors with the right to ensure fulfillment of specific rights. Let me give an example. If you want to influence the health budget, you have to work with the Ministry of Health in ensuring children's issues are prioritized in the health sector plan, they are costed, and they are then reflected in the Ministry of Health budget. So systematic, robust engagement with those responsible for fulfilling certain rights is fundamental. And for Save the Children more generally, we need to build on the momentum of ensuring that our country offices have dedicated staff with basic economic literacy to engage effectively in these issues.
Great. I mean, that is excellent tips there, and I really like your point about engaging with the sector. I would love to know how many of our country officers engage with the Ministry of Finance, for example. I think that's always a department that many of our thematic areas have not thought of engaging with, and so really, really helpful connection there. Bob, thank you so much for your time. Any last points that you'd like to share with participants?
Maybe just to say the potential of this work is phenomenal. We have to ensure we build the requisite partnerships and alliances within the child rights sector, but also beyond. So we are not just working amongst ourselves, but we are able to synergize with other economic governance actors, be they research institutions or civil society or even government departments. We cannot be experts in everything, but surely we can derive lots of strength by working with those with the competences also outside the child rights sector.
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent thought to leave our listeners on. Thank you so much for your time, Bob. We really appreciate it. Encouraging listeners to reflect on session 12 of the online training. Let us know if you have any questions. And good luck with taking this forward, Bob. It's a lot of work, but I think it's incredibly valuable. Thank you so much.
Welcome, and thanks to the participants.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.